bottom of week 4, there is a link to an article, and I'd encourage you to go pop it open and take a look at it. It's here in our state, and so we look at things like contracts. And so we'll relate this back then to the other assignment you had due. That one was of the RFP for a Chinese company, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So if you don't know anything about our state, the state decides that it's cheaper for them to farm out a lot of child care support services, specifically in the Sarpy and Douglas areas. So I think the article says 40%, if I remember right. So a huge percentage of child welfare, so those most vulnerable population Health and Human Services deals with, is farmed out to a contractor. So how can this go badly wrong? How can that go badly wrong? So the state, every, I believe, 5 years, says, here we have an RFP for it, and we give a contract to some company to do that. And so the company that got awarded the bid the last time, when it actually got awarded, because there were some issues before that, but when it actually got awarded, it was to a company called St. Francis. Is anybody here from Kansas? Nobody? All right. So St. Francis operates primarily out of Kansas, but they've started to expand. It's part of a church. Well, that's not necessarily bad. And they said, here we give a 5-year case management contract to St. Francis Ministries. All right. And the company that was primarily doing that used to be called NFC, and then it changed its names to Promise Ship, because a lot of people would put dirty words to NFC, not a clue. Anyway, in our foster care relationship, when I had one of my children in foster care, we actually dealt with them, and there's a reason why they had that clue. But they followed the state rules. And so when these contracts got bid, scroll down to get some numbers, there it is. So winning bid is about 40% of the state's total child welfare cases. Wow. So they sought bids, and there was a little issue a couple years ago, but then the last time they did it, then they said, all right, well you're going to get a bid, and you're going to do it. Where's the number? Somewhere in there. There it is. Okay. So this agency made a bid that was $197 million. Promise Ship bid $341 million. That's a lot of difference, isn't it? And in fact, they awarded the bid to St. Francis. Here's what St. Francis has so far done, though. And they actually got sued, the state did, by Promise Ship, saying they didn't agree to meet the same RFP. And so one of the biggest issues is how many cases a caseworker can have. If they have too many cases, they can't manage it adequately, and children get hurt, including maybe die. We know that's a fact. And so the state specifically says you can only have, I believe it's 20 cases in there. To get that price, Promise Ship in their documents actually said, well, we're going to have almost double that. So they violated state law in even bidding that, and Promise Ship still lost. Probably shouldn't have. There's been a couple of things that have came out of that. St. Francis then said, well, to really meet that, guess what we're going to have to do? We're going to have to up the price. So was that low bid necessarily the best for the state? I'm going to say it's not. One of the other things that Health and Human Services, so originally in this contract, all the training for their employees came directly from Promise Ship. They had to pay to train their employees. What has happened is the state is now paying to train their employees, just like they do their own state employees and state workers. And so they've had to shift around things to try to meet that original price. My guess is at the end of that 5-year contract, they are going to have spent at least as much, if not more, to do that. And what we're taking into account here, this isn't, hey, my house isn't painted really well. This is children who aren't being removed from homes they should be removed from, or getting services that they need. So sometimes we have to take in that human factor into these things. But in our state government, we are so driven by trying to cut costs that sometimes we forget things. And I think this is a great example of, oops, yeah, we're cutting costs, but we're doing it on the backs of the most vulnerable populations of people we have. We also cut costs in things like education, because, well, you know, do we need college-educated students in our state? Do we need students in K through 12 to have, you know, classrooms? No. So it's up there as an example of a contract that went wrong, it got challenged, and it's still lost. Still lost. So the one I want to look at then is I want to talk about your group assignment that was due on Sunday. So based on that information you just saw there, because one of the things I saw was most groups said, some more eloquently than others, that, well, we should extend that contract period or just automatically allow. Hey, they were late, but let's allow it. So if I'm one of the other bidders on a contract and you allow another bidder to come in a week late or 2 days late or 3 days late, what am I automatically going to do for a very large contract? What do you think I'm going to do? It starts with an S, ends with oo. Sue, yeah. So while I think that the Asia contractors may have the best options, we have to think about how we could have included them. And so one of the options that I saw a couple of people mention was, since we only had 3 bids, let's stop that bidding process and extend the time frame. That way everybody has an equal opportunity to bid. So what you would do is let contractors who had already submitted a bid revise their bid. And maybe the other thing you do is revise your RFP. If you only got 3 and you thought you were going to get 8, maybe you need to rethink those, either the pricing, maybe the structure, maybe there's something in that RFP that is stopping that. So I think you needed to look at that and come up and say, all right, this might be the best option. Depending on the structure. Now, if I'm a completely private corporation, it's less likely they'll sue. There's less chance of that. But I can guarantee if there were 5 bids on this building to remodel it a few years ago, one of them was a week late, and they were the one that we awarded the bid to, there would be an issue. So it's something you need to think about in terms of how do I make that presentation. So most groups, when they went through and built some form of table, although I think there was at least one group that didn't build me a table and just said, I select this, and the intent was to try to make that quantitative. Most of them came up with the Asia Construction Company as probably the best. And I will agree with that if we had followed that proper structure. So you'll see the grades in there for those have already popped in. So we won't spend a lot of time talking about that this week. So I posted in that Promise Ship link so you guys can see that. That's our tax dollars. And if I'm a taxpayer, which most of us are in some way or another, every time you go to the grocery store, you're paying state sales tax, right? That's a big difference from $197 to $340 million. But sometimes we have to think, are we willing to put some money into these things? And I'm going to say, based on the fact that you're at a state-supported college, you're willing to, in your brain, pay for things like education. I hope. I certainly am. There are things I am certainly willing to pay for. I think there's a great value to a college education. You guys didn't go to Creighton because you didn't want to pay that private school tuition, right? Because the private schools, about half our funding is paid for via state funds. And about half comes out of tuition. So if we weren't state supported, and a lot of states have started sliding on how much support they're giving state colleges and universities, then that tuition starts going up. Go look at Colorado, for example, where they have sliced down significantly. And some colleges are down to 10 to 15% of the funding actually comes from the state. Well, that drives that cost up. and it makes it harder for a lot of people to go to school. Now, if you're born into a family of billionaires, is anybody's dad a billionaire in here? Yep, yeah, darn it. I keep hoping. At some point, somebody's going to say yes, and I'm going to hit them up for a brand new computer lab. But we like that ability to use education as a leverage tool to move up and out of where we're at. All right, so let's talk about this week. So chapter 4, we start talking about quality, and I'll start talking a little bit about it in depth. There are some videos that are in here, and I have a couple, and we're going to try them. Even though we're not using Microsoft Project, the Project Libre is very similar. So I'm going to try these and see if we can use those. And so I will take your knowledge on that. If the grades are completely horrible, I will just flatline them out and make them non-consequential. Don't use that as an excuse just to not do it, but I think this is a great way to do it. They lead through some tutorials, so I'm going to probably get your opinion on them then after next week and see how that went, rather than try to completely reinvent the wheel. I know you guys think that, since I don't have 11 football practices, that we have all the time in the world, but we're also time limited, just like the rest of everybody. So we're going to talk about time, quality management, and somewhere I have a PowerPoint we can even start looking at here and some of those concepts. I will give you some time in class today to finish up your group or at least get a little better piece of it. All right. Are you going to go in the right one? Yay. So we want to figure out then, so our project has been successful so far. Our charter made it through. We're now able to look at how do I start planning this project in more detail. Because everything to this point, we kind of did an overarch of it. And now we need to get down in the weeds, that very detailed, hands-on approach to get down there. So the project charter, or that RFP, says some of the things. It doesn't have always as specific a details as we need. So the objective, why are we doing this? So now we're going to try to come up with some more details. And it may be that we have some of these. What do we gain from it? What does the state gain from awarding a bid to a contractor to take care of 40% of the child abuse complaints and issues in the state? What does the state gain? What's the advantage for them doing that versus having their own internal staff? So the state pays, but the hope is, if we hire somebody else, do we hope that it's cheaper? Why would it be cheaper to hire a contractor than to do the work ourselves? So the state may have more regulation on employees. Does the state tend to have more benefits? Because these caseworkers, this is kind of a horrific job. You're going to go out and be faced with situations that are so traumatic and so horrifying, involving, in most cases, small children or young children. And yet it's one of the lowest paid jobs you can get. If you go into social services to make money, you're really in trouble. It starts under $40,000 a year for a job that requires a college degree. The burnout rate for the state employees, I don't know about the contractors, I'm going to guess they're even higher. The burnout rate is literally 70% the first year leave. There are offices in Health and Human Services where the oldest employee, who's now the boss and manager of that office, has been there 3 years. The turnover rate is incredible. Contractors then, they're going to pay even less, right? Oh, that's not necessarily good. So the hope is that they save the state money. That's the whole goal of that. If the state said it was cheaper for us to do it, they would hire their own employees and just go in and take it over, right? So that goal may be, the expected benefit may be, we will save $50 million per year, a very quantitative number. maybe we also find out that there are some issues organizationally in the state. And that's certainly possible, that says it would be better if we had a contracted agency. They would have more latitude and leeway to deal with X, Y, Z organization. So other things in there. We know we're going to have a budget. And at this point now that budget starts to become more clear-cut. So before we were nebulous. We said, well, it's about $25 million. Now we're going to say $25.7 million. This is what we're going to spend. Date required to be completed. So in other words, now we start putting in some dates. And we start putting in these changes. And one of the first things we run into is something called scope. When I say the scope of a project, that is a very specific definition of what needs to be done from beginning to end and what is included in that project. So, sometimes it's items that are in that project charter, in that RFP, in other documents, but it's very, very detailed. It is also very constrained and says, this is what we expect, this is what we're willing to pay for, this is what we're going to do. Common understanding, so everybody is on the same page. So if it is a contract for a building, you may invoke building codes so that we know that we're all building according to the 2008 blah, blah, blah building code. And we have a set number of standards. If we're doing telecom work, it'll be BICSA and those kinds of standards. So that we spell out exactly what we're going to do. So one, it keeps us honest and it keeps the contractor honest. It keeps both sides on an exact same playing field. There is also something we're going to talk about called scope creep, and it hopefully avoids that also, something called scope creep. In other words, our project starts to expand. So maybe our project was to remodel this floor of the building. Scope creep would be then, well, let's redo the stairway while we're at it. And, that third floor classroom needs a coat of paint. That's that idea of expanding that scope, or project creep, scope creep. It kind of creeps out of control. And we've seen that happen a lot. Software projects are really bad about that. We actually have another term called feature creep because we keep adding additional features, and that project grows and grows and grows, and there's change orders, and the budget grows. So it will generally contain deliverables. In other words, what is the end result? So in this building, or in this room, the end result was we wanted carpet on the floor. Now, as you guys walked by there, we need to talk about quality later on, right? Because that wouldn't meet most of our definition of quality. But when you're trying to get a building done and get students in it, maybe that passed for enough quality to get that done. So it passed our acceptance criteria. We look at work breakdown structure. I know that idea. We talked about it, how you start breaking things apart. It's coming back. And now we're going to start looking at tools, how to start using those tools. And then generally we have the idea of something called a change control mechanism. Some way when change happens that we control it. And you think, well, that's what we have a project manager for, right? He's going to deal with all the change. Generally, there is actually some kind of a change control system we use. And that change control system actually takes the project manager out of the loop a little bit. So that it's not his responsibility, that if something goes wrong because of a change, that then it doesn't fall back on that project manager. And so you'll see that we look at that. So, work according to specifications, and other that quality. So we have some common standard of what is quality. So if our standard actually said the carpet needs to be plus or minus 1 inches from the wall, if that was my standard for quality, that carpet would work, right? And I use that as an example because quality is a little harder to define than we think it is. We all go, man, I know quality when I see it. But do you? Can you write out those specifications to say, this is why this isn't meeting our standard? And so those standards have to be defined very, very carefully. So things like references, standards, maybe your drawings have specific call-outs for this has to be done in this specific manner. This type of wood has to be installed. The walls have to be able to bear so much load. They have to be constructed in this manner. So all of those kinds of standards and specs are what make those get a little longer, because we have to figure out what the procedure is. What are our tools for quality? Because we can say, that Rolls-Royce, it's a more quality automobile than a Hyundai, right? You could say that. But is that really accurate? What standards do we have? If we have standards of the vehicle doesn't break to 100,000 miles, I'm going to say that Rolls-Royce doesn't meet those standards compared to a Hyundai. But if we looked at quality of ride and had a measurement for it, would a Rolls-Royce probably ride a little more comfortably than a Hyundai? I would hope so, for the cost difference. But sometimes we have to be careful of those standards. And some things that we think are really high quality. So I usually wear an Apple Watch, but I actually like watches. And so sometimes you'll see me wearing other watches, including a Rolex. My Rolex was astronomically expensive, unfortunately, compared to my Apple Watch. You know, what are they, $350 or something for an Apple Watch now? Are they that high now? Okay, I didn't think I paid that much, but whatever the one I bought, so at most $500, unless I, get the crystal diamond studded bracelet or something. And my main function for my watch is it tells me time. The Rolex also tells me time. And I will tell you, the Rolex I have, when I bought it, was $13,000. And do you know what it doesn't do worth a damn? It doesn't do that. It doesn't answer my phone calls. It doesn't keep really great time. And so I look at it, if my only objective of having a watch is that I wanted something that kept accurate time, my Rolex fails, and the $29 Timex that you can buy at Walmart is going to be far more accurate and have far more functions. Heck, for $30 you can get one that's got a calculator on it, does all kinds of things. But maybe that's not the function of that watch, and so we'd have to define that very carefully in those standards. So, some of us like things for whatever reason as kind of a hobby. We like to collect. I like to collect watches. My wife doesn't understand this. That's okay. Her standards for something that she collects is probably different than what I collect. All right, so it's got to have a reference. It's got to have some way to say, this is my ideal. So if my ideal for a watch was to be a quality watch, it had to keep accuracy within 10 seconds a month, that Rolex is going to fail. And quite frankly, it's a pain in the butt. So this, my Apple Watch, yeah, I do have to plug it in every couple days. My Rolex, unless you're wearing it, I have a special case it goes into, and it gently rocks the watch to keep it wound up. Quite frankly, I paid far more for the watch box than I paid for the Apple Watch. So that quality thing we have to think about. Because in our brains, a lot of times we think quality means luxurious. And so we need to kind of step back and take a look at that. When we talk automobiles, if we're thinking reliability, Hyundai actually is one of the most reliable automobiles you can buy by most firms that actually measure that. Interesting. So we'll look at that and we'll talk about those. How do we monitor that project? The other thing we need in there is, how do we monitor as it goes along? We need some way to monitor and keep that project going according to our plans. If we don't, it ends up wrong, and then we have to go back and redo it. And that is vastly more expensive than doing it correctly the first time. We look at that idea of where that cost is. It's always cheaper to do things right the first time. Anybody in here like Ford vehicles? All right, you bought a Ford, didn't you? Yep. I'm sorry for you. Oh, that's not many miles for that old. But so we'll pick on Fords. So Ford, they bring out a car or a truck, and they screw up putting in the starter in the truck. At the assembly line, that would be easy to fix, wouldn't it? Doesn't cost much at all. But it gets missed. And it gets all the way to the dealership. And if the dealership would have noticed it or paid attention, it could be fixed there. But now it's at a higher cost, right? It costs more money because they have already got the vehicle. And then that highest cost, if it's already been delivered to a customer, that's the highest cost. If you already have that car in your driveway and it doesn't start, are you a happy customer? No. So not only do you have, I have to spend a lot more money to fix it, but you have that goodwill and some of these other intangibles that we need to deal with. And so I did that. I bought a Ford once. See the word once in there? No, I bought several. But in 1997, I bought a Ford pickup. And I went onto the lot, bought it. It was pretty, it was new, it was shiny, brand new. Top of the line 1970 or 97 Ford pickup. And I drove it all the way down to a restaurant. It's about 8 blocks away. And I had called some of my friends. We were going to go eat. Go outside and the truck won't start. This is the day I bought it. And it's now about, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock. Dealership's still open, but the repair department's already closed. And I get a hold of them, and they tell me that, well, the repair department's closed, but they're running a couple weeks behind, so it'll probably be 2 weeks before we can fix your truck. I've now had this truck about 3 hours in my possession. Was I a happy customer? And as it turns out, because the dealership did call and try to save this deal eventually, it turns out it was a 50-cent part didn't get installed correctly on the starter. At least that's their claim. I don't know. But I did not end up buying that truck. I ended up my friends drove me back down, and we took my truck back, even though over the objection of the salesman, because I had an extra key. And we took it back, loaded all my stuff back from one to the other, and I said, you guys can see a letter from my lawyer. I'm canceling the check that I wrote to you. And it got pretty ugly. And that's that cost. It was much more expensive at the end to deal with it. Now, could they have saved it had they said, oh my goodness, that's really horrible. We'll bring you down a loaner right now. Would that have been a different experience? Yeah, I would hope so, but still probably would have been a little unsettling. So that idea of quality starts to get important. Part of the way we deal with all of this is the idea of work breakdown structures. You guys have done it. You just didn't realize what you were doing. When you guys got into a team already, you've started delegating out tasks and assignments and pieces. And the way you did that was you created a work breakdown structure, but you did it in more of a casual or laissez-faire approach. You didn't have a definitive way that you did that. So what we're going to do is we're going to group into logical groupings, and then we break into subgroupings. And what our eventual goal is to break down in small enough pieces that we know that this can be done, and we know how it can be done, and how long it's going to take, and how much it's going to cost in terms of resources. And resources really are time, money, other equipment we're using. So we're trying to break things down, and we create this work breakdown structure. And so we break it down further and further and further until we get down to areas that we can handle and manage and understand. So if I just say, hey, I'm going to task you with creating a job fair, do you have any idea how much time, effort, or what is involved in that? No. So you're going to, unofficially, you're going to start writing down things down and go, I need to break this off and do this and that. And that's what we're doing here. This way we're doing it in a more formal manner. The other thing you'll notice we start doing is assigning people and resources to these tasks. Well, these are the very things we're going to put into that Project Libre or you put into Microsoft Project, because we're breaking them down into useful pieces that we can understand and implement. So, I really like this graphical method better, and we'll show you another method. Some people prefer one over the other. The other thing you'll notice is it comes down here and starts breaking apart into levels and into details. Each level you add another dot and another number. And every item number or piece in that work breakdown structure has a unique number associated with it. So when I say I need task 5.2.2, that's only this task. And I can see who it's assigned to, how long it's going to take, what the requirements are for it. So I can start breaking these down into smaller and smaller pieces. So the other way our book shows you is something they call indentured list, indented list, whatever you want to call it. It really just says, all right, here we go. But I think the graphical method makes more sense for most of us. Most people I know are graphical. You see things in your brain, and if you write it out, it makes more sense. If you have these all drawn out. And there are tools, and we'll show you some of those tools that are out there, but this is a really great tool. So notice we break it out. This is exactly the same information, but it's in a graphical form or a text form. There is software outside of Microsoft Project and the Project Libre that will do similar things. So there's a lot of software out there that's designed to break things into pieces. So the other piece then is that responsibility matrix. And so taking that item, then we have a matrix of who is responsible. Because in some cases we break it down into tasks that require more than one person. So if I said, man, one of the tasks we're going to break down is to picking up all the trash after a college football game. Is that just a one-person job? No. And if you've had to do that, that's a pretty good chunk of responsibility. So that responsibility matrix then says who's primary, who's support. So it can be another tool that you use to try to identify who you're using. When we put things into an electronic format, then you can actually assign individuals what their cost is, how much time. But the goal in all this, again, I don't know how long it's going to take to clean the entire football stadium at UNL, for example. But I do know how long it would take me to clean like a 10-foot long section of bench. I can envision that, and I can say, oh yeah, 20 minutes I could have that all scrubbed down. And so you're breaking things down into small enough units that you can put quantities to them. And that's kind of the goal here, is we're trying to break it down in that work breakdown structure. Small enough quantities that we can put times to them. Once we've done more projects, so if you're a project manager, once you've done this 137 times, you know that maybe framing out a room takes 2 people and takes 10 hours. And you have those ideas pretty well down, and you can write them down. We'll also look at some ideas how to get some time, some better time estimates. But learning from your past and what you've done previously is really one of the best things you get out of project management. Once you've been in there, that historical information. If you're the first-time project manager for a company, though, do you have that historical information? If they've done other projects, are you able to access those resources and see what they did? I hope, because that's that value of seeing what other projects have done. They may even have templates predefined in whatever tool they're using that say, hey, if I'm going to build a wall, I know it's this long, this many employees per this many running feet, and it gives you some rules to follow by based on what has happened previously. There are also industry standards you can find. There is probably an industry standard that says to clean 10 foot of bleachers in a football stadium takes 2 minutes, and you can then start applying some of that similar logic to what goes on. So, work breakdown structures. We're going to start identifying how we can break these down. Now, there is a limit to how far we break them down. And so this is a judgment call. So if I'm really breaking it down to not just cleaning those benches, but I'm down to, well, we're going to run the air sweepers or we're going to run brooms, we can get too far down in the weeds. And so it's a judgment call. How far down do I need to break that package so that I can understand it? Framing a wall. If you're a contractor, some of you have probably worked construction jobs in the summer. Don's like, no, thank goodness, I've never had to do that, right? But some of you may have done that. In that case, you have a pretty good idea about what goes into framing a wall. You don't necessarily need to say, a work breakdown package is install one 2x4 and install another 2x4. You could put in frame wall. We all understand what's going on in that procedure. And so there are limits to how far down we want to go in our list. So some of these, if you look at something like this where it says prepare mailing labels, I don't need to break it down to, oh, it took 2 minutes to download the program and 2 minutes to install the software and 2 minutes to click print. We know what that means, right? So that's where we get too far down in the weeds. So there are some judgment calls. What one person or one project management group or what one company says is this is how far we're going to go down may be different. It may differ from organization to organization. What's my time? All right. I promised you some time. So I'm going to introduce this. We are not going to get in the weeds on this until Thursday. So you need to make sure you've read about network diagrams and critical path methods and PERT methods and all these fun things. So a network diagram is how we sequence activities. So we looked a little bit, you saw a little bit when we introduced you to Project Libre and Microsoft Project about how it had a predecessor or a dependency. So a network diagram is how we organize tasks based on what is required to be done prior. So if we go too far down in the weeds and I'm listing sweep the floor, mop the floor, which one do we do first? We sweep first, right? That makes a lot of sense. We're not going to mop before we sweep. That's that idea of that dependency. Mopping is dependent on sweeping. And so we know that those tasks have to be in a specific order. We're going to build some tools like this, and then there's things that can happen all at the same time. So I could have somebody mopping at the same time somebody else is cleaning a countertop. Those kinds of things that we can look at in terms of can they be done concurrently? And how do we build a diagram like this? And then finally, we're going to look at how do I determine how long this project is really going to take? So I can look at all those activity times, and if I add them all up, this may be 100 weeks. But when I look at this diagram, I know that some of this is happening at the same time. So my project is probably not the sum of all the activities. There's probably some magical method to it, and we're going to call that the critical path method. So once we construct our network diagram, it is the longest path through that diagram to get the shortest time for our project. Wait, huh? So the longest time period through here. So if I start here and I work through and I always go to the longest task through here, I get the length of this project. It's the shortest time we can do the entire project, but it's based on putting together the longest task times anytime we have multiple events. So we'll work on that. We'll look at that. All right. So we have an assignment due tonight with your groups. We have more people than I've had in class in a long time. I'm excited by that. So I am going to let you guys work in your virtual groups. Remember social distancing. I have not got anybody to turn in the entire project yet. So I don't think that they are done. So we're going to give you the rest of the class to work on that. It's also a good time you can ask questions if you need to and say, hey, Mr. Griffin, what about this? Should I include this? And I will say, yes, no, maybe. It's your decision. Those kinds of answers. All right, any questions right off the hand? You need to make sure you read this chapter over and over again. I know it will put you to sleep. Make sure you read chapter 4 over and over and over again. Because we are going to work with a lot of these, and this is where we start getting into this icky thing called math in here. So we're going to start getting some math problems in here. All right, any questions? What are we going to do on Thursday? Critical path and networking and sequencing. All right, so I will give you the rest of this class period to work on your group